I moved to Kenya in 2010, and I originally planned to stay there for about 6 months working with local peace activists. And I was working with them in response to election-related violence that happened in 2007 and 2008 with the aim of preventing further violence. My goal was to uplift and support the work that local peace builders were doing. But once I got on the ground on an informal settlement in Eastlands in Nairobi and started talking to local peace builders, I learned about this particular challenge that they were facing. And when they talked to me about what they had experienced in 2007, 2008, they didn't just talk about gasoline and matches or machetes or guns. They also talked about cell phones. And they talked specifically about how phones were used to spread misinformation, rumors, fear, to organize weapons distribution and attacks during the violence, as well as to psychologically and emotionally prepare people for it. And so looking at what happened in 2007, 2008, Kenya was not a stranger to election-related violence, but the violence had never been so widespread, had never lasted for so long. And it was also the first time that people had phones. And so the information that led up to and accompanied the violence was not only being spread over mediums that had existed for a longer time, like local radio stations. That information was also being spread through phones, and it was able to be spread faster and across a broader geography than ever before. And the local peace activists that I met and talked to didn't feel like they could compete with that flow of information. They didn't feel like they were equipped or had the tools or knew where to begin to use that same tool, to use mobile phones and text messages for peace rather than for violence. And so I ended up staying in Kenya for 4 years, and together with this initial group of peace activists, as well as more who joined on later, we started an organization called Sisi ni Amani, and that means we are peace in Swahili. And what we did is we did a lot of analysis. We mapped out and looked at how was communication relating to violence. What were the steps from a rumor starting to people being called to organize themselves or to arm. And once we mapped out how that information flowed in communities and how that communication was used to help prepare and walk communities towards violence, we created our own set of tools. We created our own strategy. And what we did is we said, we know that fear spreads fast. We know that a rumor that says they're coming to get you, they're coming to get us, is always going to spread faster than a message that asks people to stay calm, that asks people to question rumors. So what we realized is that in order to compete, we had to start out 10, 50, 100 steps ahead. And rather than just spread messages organically, we actually needed to build the base of people that we were going to reach before anything started. So over the years leading up to the 2013 elections, we built a text messaging platform, and through door-to-door outreach, we subscribed 65,000 community members to that platform. And they signed up with their numbers, with their demographic information, and we were able to target messages to specific geographic locations, whether a slum or a town or a village, in response to different events. And once we had those numbers, we knew that when there was tension or a rumor or a risk of violence, we could reach 5,000 people the second that we heard that something was going on, for example, in a particular slum. But once we had those numbers, we also realized there was so much more that we could do to organize positive action. So we preempted rumors by doing a civic education curriculum over text message. And we also used our platform to catalyze people to engage civically. We used the platform to invite people to in-person political debates, educational events about conflicts like land. And we also used it to push people to listen to radio programming that had civic education and civic engagement broadcasting, like the debates that we had. So essentially we took this tool that had been used really effectively to mobilize for violence, and we figured out how we could mobilize it to prevent violence by educating people about the rumors that they might hear, by giving them actions that they could take to address grievances and come together across conflict lines, and by responding in real time to tensions, misinformation, and risks of violence. When it comes to this debate about whether phones are good for peace or good for violence, whether they cause violence and hinder peace-building efforts, or whether they do nothing, or whether they're good for peace-building efforts, My answer maybe falls somewhere in between or outside the debate. From my perspective, phones are a tool. Just like every other means of communication are a tool. The printing press is a tool. The internet is a tool. Every social media site is a tool. All of these are tools that we use to communicate. They don't fundamentally change our human impulses. They don't fundamentally change conflict dynamics. What they change is how fast information can spread and over which geographies it can spread. So they change not just like the speed, for example, with which a rumor may travel, but they also change the breadth, the geographic scope over which it can travel, so that you can have someone like we saw in Kenya who might live in an urban informal settlement in Nairobi but has family out in a rural area can say, this is what they're doing to us here. Can you take action there? And so that does change different dynamics, but I don't think it's as new as we think it is. I think with every evolution of the technology that lets us communicate with each other faster and differently, we see our human tendencies, we see politics, we see power adjust and play out using those new tools. And so I don't think that as a tool, phones are fundamentally built to lead to more or less violence. I think that they make it easier to coordinate, mobilize, and spread information, and to do it across broader geographies. And I think what that means for peace or conflict depends on who takes advantage of that tool, who understands it, and who uses it more effectively. So when it comes to whether phones contribute to violence or not, they can. They're a tool. And so when people who have the goal to create violence, who are organizing for violence, use that tool strategically and effectively, it can create more violence. It allows for better coordination. This can be a great tool for people who want to mobilize for violence. But again, I don't think it's something fundamentally about phones. It's a tool. It doesn't have a direction associated with it. It can be used for good or it can be used for harm. And I think why we might see it sometimes correlating with an increase in violence, or why we might see times where phones are used for violence very effectively as a communication tool, it's in part because we haven't yet seen the peace building field figure out how to tap into that resource and tap into that tool and use it just as effectively. So my point about phones is that they're not inherently a tool for peace or a tool for violence. They're a tool that fundamentally changes the way that communication happens, and whether that helps lead to violence or lead to peace depends on who uses them and how effectively. I don't think it's something inherently built into phones. What I think is inherent is that it changes the speed, the breadth of information, and it increases coordination and mobilization. I think we've been hearing that debate here in the United States and all over the place about social media and the internet. Does this fuel hate and dangerous speech? Does this fuel conflict and division and polarization? Or can it be a tool for good? And I would have a really similar answer for that. When we have these new tools to communicate, they magnify, they multiply often our human impulses. So we all have, for example, an inclination to look for information that agrees with us and to dismiss information that's contradictory to our existing beliefs. So we see with the internet what we call echo chambers or bubbles information bubbles that people exist in. That's not because of the internet. That's because it's our human psychological tendencies meeting the internet, meeting this new tool that gives us more choice and more capacity to sort and select information. And so I would think of phones and of that in the same way, where we can ask ourselves, what is it about human psychology, politics, conflict, power, that already exists and that's meeting a new tool? And are there ways that this new tool might fundamentally change the dynamics that exist on the ground? In terms of defining different types of speech, I think this is a really interesting question. So we hear a lot about the term hate speech, and our work right now doesn't focus so much on hate speech. Hate speech can be really limited. It's often speech that intends to be malicious or has a hateful emotion behind it. It might use certain terms or slurs. But the term is really defined in terms of the intent often, or in terms of a pretty static definition of what content it may or may not apply to. And where I get really interested in looking at communication is in looking at what is the communication that has a negative impact. I want to think about what's the type of speech or the type of communication that increases the risk that a society will move towards identity-based conflict, will move towards targeting different groups with harm. And so there's different concepts that are out there. We can look at things like incitement. We can look at concepts like dangerous speech, which comes from the atrocity prevention world and looks at speech that increases the risk its audience will condone or participate in group-targeted violence. There's a lot of different ways to think about this speech, but where I get most interested is in analyzing the overall patterns of speech, the overall ecosystem of speech and information, and the ways that it contributes to things like dehumanization, the painting of a group as a threat, increasing policing of in-group norms for violence. Those are the types of narratives and the types of speech that I'm most interested in, and I'm most interested in looking at them at the societal level so that we can start to identify what are these patterns and what is the impact communication is having on the risk of conflict, because then we know what impact we need to undo. If we see shifting social norms in a negative direction, if we see in-group pressures that people are starting to face to engage in negative behavior, if we see dehumanization of a group or the painting of that group as a threat, we know that we need to take some action to undermine the impact of that speech. What's been interesting for me over the past few years, coming back from Kenya and starting Over Zero and doing a lot of work in Europe and here in the United States, is looking at how much different contexts have to learn from each other. There's so much that's different depending on where you are, but there's so much that stays fundamentally the same. And all the patterns of speech that we see, even if the content looks different from place to place, we do see patterns that arise over and over again that are very applicable here in the United States, for example. And when we know those patterns, it gives us an extra tool to analyze what's happening in our own backyard, as well as what's happening elsewhere. And a lot of the tools that we have to take action, a lot of what we know about what works and the things that need to be addressed, I also think remain at some fundamental levels very similar. So in my work, identifying that it's really important to be for something and not just against something if you're pushing back on hate or dangerous speech. The importance of understanding social norms overall in society and for different groups. Understanding how people perceive themselves and their identity and the types of information that feel threatening to them versus safe for them, and the frames and narratives that they bought into. There's a lot in terms of the process you use and the type of knowledge that we need to address these issues here in the US and internationally. And so for me at least, it's been really interesting and important to take this international lens that we've been using and learning to study this for so long, and use that as a tool and use that as an added value that we can bring to looking at what's happening in the United States and how we can move forward here. The question about the role of journalists and journalism and the media is really interesting. I think that journalism plays a key role in all of this and on so many different levels. I think that there's a lot of training and resources that are out there and knowledge that we have that could be really useful to journalists who want to figure out how to report on some of these things without actually worsening them through their reporting. And there's a lot we know about how to, for example, avoid further dehumanizing a group, how to undermine some of the things that fuel polarization. And I think that there's a big role for journalists to play, because I often think some of the narratives that get built up in the media can be really harmful. They're not overt hate speech, but they have inherent to them some of these narratives. The idea that a group is a threat, the idea that all members of a group are somehow responsible for the actions of a few, and that negative actions get attributed to an entire group or a part of their identity. There's all these narratives that get fed by the way that the media reports, and just educating them on that, I think, could go a really long way. And I also think that there's a big opportunity for the media to play a role in bridging divides. We know that when we're in conflict, we often tend to misattribute the motivations behind another side's actions. And so starting to debunk that, showing and humanizing people who land on different sides of a conflict can be really helpful in showing what their motivations are and showing common experiences. There's so much that can be done by the media to sort of unmask a lot of these assumptions that we're making about each other.